The classified document Patricia Silva was translating contained details about human trafficking networks operating between Colombia and the United States, but she was being trafficked herself by the very organization that had hired her to expose such crimes. The ambassador from Venezuela sitting across from her in the luxury Washington, D.C. hotel suite wasn't interested in the document's contents. He was negotiating for her sexual services in exchange for information about drug cartel operations that the State Department desperately needed. Her linguistic skills had brought her to America's corridors of power, only to discover that diplomacy's most sensitive transactions involved trading women like commodities. The journey to this nightmare had begun with genuine academic excellence and desperate family circumstances in Bogotá. Patricia had graduated summa cum laude from Universidad Nacional with degrees in linguistics and international relations, fluent in Spanish, English, Portuguese, and French. She'd specialized in legal translation, worked with human rights organizations, dreamed of using her language skills to promote justice and international cooperation. But Colombia's economic instability had made professional advancement nearly impossible. Government agencies couldn't afford qualified translators. NGOs operated on volunteer labor, and private companies paid wages that barely covered basic survival. When violence erupted in her neighborhood and her younger sister was threatened by narco gangs demanding protection money, Patricia faced the same impossible choice confronting millions of educated Latin Americans. The opportunity from international language services appeared through university placement programs, offering positions for qualified translators to work with diplomatic missions in Washington, D.C. The salary was substantial, 20 times what Patricia could earn in Bogotá, and the work promised to involve high-level international negotiations where her skills could make real differences in global affairs. The application process was rigorous and seemingly legitimate. Written translations of complex legal documents, oral interpretation examinations conducted via video call, background checks that verified her academic credentials and clean criminal record. Everything suggested a professional organization that valued competence and integrity in its translators. Victoria Ashworth, the agency's director, conducted the final interview personally. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, spoke multiple languages herself, demonstrated deep knowledge of international diplomacy. Her questions focused on Patricia's ability to handle sensitive information, work under pressure, maintain confidentiality in situations where state secrets might be involved. The agency specialized in providing linguistic services for unofficial diplomatic channels. Victoria explained, when governments needed to communicate about sensitive topics without creating official records, they used private translation services that could ensure both accuracy and discretion. Patricia's role would involve facilitating conversations that shaped international policy, but couldn't be conducted through normal diplomatic procedures. The visa sponsorship process was handled through legitimate government channels, with international language services providing documentation that established Patricia as a skilled professional whose expertise was needed for American foreign policy operations. Immigration officers processed her application efficiently, recognizing the agency's reputation for providing essential services to diplomatic missions. The journey to Washington, D.C. was Patricia's first international flight, a symbol of how far her education and language skills had taken her from the poverty of her childhood. She carried hopes not just for personal advancement, but for sending money home to protect her family, and eventually bringing them to safety in America through family reunification programs. Washington, D.C. exceeded every expectation. International language services occupied elegant offices near Embassy Row, with conference rooms equipped for simultaneous interpretation, secure communication systems, and the sophisticated technology needed for high-level diplomatic work. The staff moved with the quiet efficiency of those handling important but sensitive responsibilities. But there were no other translators. Victoria explained that the agency operated on a project basis, bringing in specialists for specific assignments rather than maintaining permanent staff. Patricia's linguistic combination and security clearance made her perfect for an exclusive contract involving ongoing negotiations between several Latin American governments and various U.S. agencies. The work would be intensive but extremely well compensated. Her housing was a furnished apartment in Georgetown, comfortable and conveniently located near the agency's offices. The arrangement felt professional and appropriate for someone whose work required absolute discretion. Patricia spent her first week studying briefing materials about current diplomatic issues, familiarizing herself with specialized terminology, preparing for what she assumed will be complex but straightforward translation work. The first assignment seemed routine, a meeting between a Colombian trade representative and State Department officials about anti-narcotics cooperation. Patricia's role was to provide simultaneous interpretation, ensuring that nuanced policy discussions weren't lost due to language barriers. The setting was a private conference room in an upscale hotel, away from official government buildings for security reasons. But the Colombian representative wasn't discussing trade policy. Ambassador Carlos Mendoza was negotiating the sale of intelligence about cartel operations in exchange for favorable treatment of Colombian officials who'd been compromised by criminal organizations. The conversation Patricia was translating involved drug trafficking routes, money laundering schemes, and the identities of government officials who were either helping or hindering American anti-drug efforts. The real shock came when Ambassador Mendoza's demands shifted from policy concessions to personal services. He'd noticed Patricia during the translation, commented on her intelligence and attractiveness, suggested that his cooperation might depend on additional accommodations being provided. The State Department officials didn't seem surprised by this turn in negotiations. Victoria later explained what Patricia had stumbled into. International Language Services didn't just provide translation for diplomatic communications. It provided comprehensive services that facilitated unofficial agreements between governments. When diplomatic negotiations involved sensitive topics or required informal channels, personal incentives were often necessary to ensure cooperation. Patricia's linguistic skills were essential, but her youth and attractiveness were equally valuable assets in negotiations where older male officials expected certain accommodations in exchange for their cooperation. Her role involved translating both verbal communications and physical interactions that sealed deals the formal diplomatic process couldn't achieve. The legal framework Victoria described made Patricia's situation seem both professional and inescapable. Her security clearance required absolute discretion about everything she witnessed. Her work visa was tied to continued employment with the agency, and the national security implications of the work she was supporting meant that refusal to cooperate could result in serious consequences. The other women working for International Language Services were all highly educated professionals who'd been recruited through similar false premises. There was Elena from Venezuela, who thought she was joining UNESCO translation programs. Maria from Mexico, who believed she was working for international human rights organizations. Ana from Peru, who'd assumed she was supporting diplomatic efforts to combat trafficking. All had discovered that their linguistic expertise was real, but secondary to their primary function as sophisticated escorts for foreign officials whose cooperation America needed for various geopolitical objectives. Their degrees were legitimate, their language skills genuine, but their services had been redefined to include sexual negotiations that diplomats could characterize as relationship building rather than prostitution. Victoria's operation exploited both the women's professional ambitions and their vulnerability as immigrants dependent on work visas. The translation work they provided was authentic and necessary, but it was also cover for sexual services that facilitated unofficial diplomatic agreements. Their linguistic abilities made them valuable in negotiations where communication was both verbal and physical. The clients who purchased translation services were paying for access to educated, multilingual women who could participate in diplomatic negotiations while also providing sexual gratification that sealed unofficial agreements. Sessions combined legitimate interpretation work with intimate encounters that clients could characterize as relationship building rather than explicit transactions. Patricia's second assignment involved a Venezuelan oil minister who controlled access to petroleum reserves that American energy companies desperately wanted. His demands for cooperation included not just policy concessions, but personal entertainment that supposedly helped build the trust necessary for sensitive business relationships. Patricia was expected to provide both translation services and whatever personal attention the minister required. The hotel suite where negotiations took place was equipped with conference facilities and bedroom amenities in equal measure. Patricia translated discussions about oil extraction rights during the day, then provided intimate companionship that allegedly helped the minister feel comfortable sharing sensitive information about Venezuelan energy policies. Her linguistic skills made the professional interactions convincing, while her sexual availability sealed the personal relationships. The minister wasn't interested in developing legitimate business relationships or advancing Venezuelan interests. He wanted the experience of wielding power over an intelligent, educated woman, while conducting business that would personally enrich him. Patricia's translation expertise made his negotiations more effective, while her sexual compliance demonstrated the respect he felt entitled to receive. Other assignments followed similar patterns. Foreign officials who possessed information or influence that American interests needed, but who expected personal incentives beyond formal diplomatic offerings. Patricia translated their demands while simultaneously becoming part of what they were demanding. Her professional skills facilitated negotiations that included her own exploitation. The documents Patricia translated often dealt with the very crimes being perpetrated against her. Anti-trafficking agreements between governments, extradition treaties for sexual exploitation cases, international cooperation protocols for protecting vulnerable women. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was helping negotiate policies designed to prevent exactly what was happening to her. Victoria's business model was brilliant in its exploitation of both diplomatic necessity and professional vulnerability. Foreign officials could receive sexual services while maintaining the fiction that they were engaging in relationship building necessary for international cooperation. Educated women could be recruited through professional channels, then gradually coerced into providing services that facilitated America's unofficial diplomatic objectives. The agency's location and presentation added legitimacy that made the operation almost impossible to recognize as trafficking. Everything looked professional. The Washington, D.C. address, the security clearances, the qualified staff, the legitimate government contracts. Even the women providing services were genuinely educated professionals who could discuss international policy competently while being sexually exploited. Patricia's attempts to refuse certain assignments were met with reminders about her security clearance obligations, her family's dependence on the money she was sending home, and the national security implications of negotiations she was supporting. Victoria's lawyers had crafted agreements that made the women responsible for substantial consequences if they compromised sensitive diplomatic operations. The psychological toll was severe. Patricia had entered linguistics to facilitate communication and understanding between cultures, but her expertise was being used to justify her own exploitation. Foreign officials paid for access to someone qualified to translate their demands while also satisfying their personal desires, combining professional competence with sexual availability. Some clients were almost respectful, treating the encounters as necessary business relationships that happened to include intimate components. Others were cruel, using their diplomatic immunity and political power to act out fantasies they claimed were essential for building the trust necessary for international cooperation. All understood exactly what kind of services they were purchasing, regardless of whatever policy objectives they claimed to be advancing. The breaking point came during her 4th month. Patricia was assigned to facilitate negotiations between a Brazilian defense minister and Pentagon officials about military cooperation in anti-drug operations. The Brazilian official demanded that Patricia accompany him to his embassy for private translation work that supposedly required absolute security. The embassy session revealed the full scope of how her linguistic skills were being exploited. Patricia wasn't just translating conversations between a minister and American officials. She was helping him communicate with criminal organizations about how military cooperation could be structured to benefit drug trafficking operations rather than prevent them. Her translation work was facilitating corruption rather than combating it. The minister's personal demands were equally disturbing. He wanted Patricia to translate communications with his wife in Brazil, explaining how his diplomatic mission was progressing while simultaneously demonstrating his power over American resources. The phone calls home became elaborate deceptions where Patricia's language skills were used to maintain domestic relationships while facilitating international exploitation. That night, locked in the embassy while the minister conducted business that mixed diplomacy with criminality, Patricia understood that her situation would never improve through compliance. Victoria's operation was designed to use women's professional skills to facilitate corruption while making them complicit in the very crimes they'd initially hoped to help prevent. The escape opportunity came when the minister's communications were intercepted by federal agents investigating corruption in Brazilian military contracts. Patricia's translation work had unknowingly documented criminal activities that provided evidence for a broader investigation into how diplomatic immunity was being used to facilitate international crime. The FBI agents who interviewed Patricia understood that her linguistic expertise had been used both to facilitate and document criminal activities. Her detailed knowledge of multiple languages, combined with evidence of the sexual services she'd been forced to provide, convinced investigators that International Language Services was operating a sophisticated trafficking scheme under cover of diplomatic support. The investigation revealed that Victoria's agency had been facilitating corruption between foreign officials and American interests for several years. Translation services were provided to ensure accurate communication about bribes, policy manipulations, and criminal cooperation agreements. The women providing linguistic support were also being used as personal incentives for foreign officials whose cooperation was needed for various unofficial American objectives. The raid on International Language Services was coordinated with arrests at diplomatic facilities where translation sessions were in progress. Federal agents found detailed records of the services provided, communication intercepts that revealed criminal activities, and evidence that Victoria had been operating similar agencies in other diplomatic centers under different names. Patricia's rescue felt surreal. One moment she was translating conversations about military equipment sales that would benefit drug cartels. The next she was being debriefed by federal agents who understood that her professional skills had been used to facilitate both her exploitation and international crime. The transition from victim to key witness happened quickly, but processing the trauma would take much longer. The legal proceedings revealed the scope of Victoria's operation and the officials who participated in it. Over 4 years, she trafficked dozens of women with linguistic backgrounds, all recruited through false promises of professional diplomatic opportunities. The foreign officials who purchased services included representatives from several governments whose cooperation America needed for various geopolitical objectives. Most foreign officials claimed diplomatic immunity and returned to their home countries before facing consequences. Their governments generally protected them from prosecution, viewing their activities as personal conduct that shouldn't affect official relationships. Some were quietly reassigned to different positions, but few faced meaningful punishment for their participation in trafficking operations. Victoria received a 25-year sentence for trafficking, fraud, and facilitating corruption, but many aspects of her operation remained classified due to national security concerns. The full extent of how diplomatic negotiations have been influenced by sexual exploitation couldn't be revealed without compromising ongoing international relationships and intelligence operations. Patricia's T visa eventually led to permanent residency, then citizenship. She found work with a legitimate international organization, providing translation services for human rights documentation and anti-trafficking investigations. The career she dreamed of took a different form than expected, but it involved authentic linguistic work rather than facilitating her own exploitation. The other women faced varied outcomes. Elena's knowledge of Venezuelan government operations made her valuable to intelligence agencies, but also made her a target for retribution. Maria returned to Mexico, but found it difficult to work in international relations while carrying the trauma of how her professional skills had been exploited. Ana remained in witness protection, her extensive knowledge of Peruvian corruption making her too dangerous to expose. Therapy helped Patricia understand that her linguistic abilities hadn't been destroyed, just temporarily corrupted by those who'd used them to facilitate criminal activities. She learned to separate her authentic desire to facilitate international communication from translation, work she'd been forced to provide for exploitive purposes. Language could still build bridges between cultures, even after being used to facilitate exploitation. The diplomatic community's response to the scandal was predictably muted. Some agencies implemented new oversight procedures for translation services, but the fundamental dynamics that created demand for unofficial diplomatic channels remained unchanged. Foreign officials still expected personal incentives for their cooperation, and vulnerable professionals still needed opportunities that could be manipulated by those willing to exploit them. Patricia spoke at conferences about trafficking in professional settings, warning linguists and other skilled workers about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. But she knew her audience included both genuine reformers and potential recruiters studying her words for insight into how to identify and exploit vulnerable professionals more effectively. 3 years after her rescue, Patricia worked with survivors of various trafficking operations, providing translation services that helped them navigate legal proceedings and access services. Her linguistic skills were finally being used for their intended purpose, facilitating communication and understanding between people who needed help rather than enabling those who sought to exploit vulnerability. She kept her academic transcripts and professional certifications, proof that her expertise was legitimate even when its application had been corrupted. The languages she spoke hadn't changed, but her understanding of how communication could be weaponized had deepened. Linguistic ability could be a tool for connection or exploitation, depending on who controlled its use. The Washington, D.C. offices that had housed international language services were rented to a legitimate translation company that provided actual diplomatic support. But Patricia knew the location was irrelevant. Similar operations continued in other cities, other contexts, wherever the demand for unofficial diplomatic services created opportunities for those willing to exploit professional ambitions. She'd come to America to translate words that would promote international understanding and cooperation. Instead, she discovered how her linguistic skills could be used to facilitate corruption while making her complicit in the very crimes she'd hoped to help prevent. The diplomatic world that had promised to value her expertise had instead used it to attract foreign officials who expected sexual access to educated women as part of their cooperation agreements. But her languages survived, even if the context changed. Patricia continued using her linguistic abilities, just for different purposes and different clients. The skills couldn't be stripped away by those who'd exploited them, and her commitment to authentic communication remained stronger than the trauma of being used to facilitate diplomatic corruption. The foreign officials who'd purchased her translation and sexual services continued conducting business through similar arrangements. The diplomatic system that had enabled her exploitation remained largely unchanged, protected by classification levels and international agreements that prioritize cooperation over accountability. The unofficial channels that facilitated her trafficking continued operating under different names with different women. Patricia knew that somewhere in Washington's diplomatic community, other language professionals were being recruited through false promises of career advancement, only to discover that their expertise would be used to justify their sexual exploitation while facilitating international corruption. The art of translation continued to be perverted by those who saw skilled professionals as commodities to be traded rather than experts to be respected.